Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight. We're going to have a great conversation. Before we get started, I'd like all of our attendees to log in where you're watching us from in the chat window. We love seeing where all of our attendees or our webinars are coming from. So log in the chat window and tell us where you're watching tonight's webinar from. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Jesse J. Holland. I am the Saturday host for Washington Journal on C-SPAN. I'm also a professor at George Washington University in the School of Media and Public Affairs. I also am a longtime reporter, having spent more than 20 years with the Associated Press here in Washington, D.C., where I am in the White House, the U.S. Capitol, and in the Supreme Court. So before we get started, I want to give you a brief summary of who we are and what we're doing for those of you who are new to our talks here. The International Community of the Society of Professional Journalists is a community of journalists that encourages press freedom globally. Our aim with these IC talks is to connect journalists with fellow journalists and experts from all around the world. With these conversations, we aim to dig a little deeper into what it means to be a journalist in today's world and to also look at issues that affect us across the globe. We want to create opportunities for you, our viewers, to have direct access to our guests. And we hope you learn, grow, and take away from today information that's going to help you and inspire you in your work going forward. Now, our format tonight will be simple. The guests and I will have a conversation. While we chat, I want you to post your questions in the Q&A option, which is usually at the bottom of your screen. Once we have your question, we'll unmute your microphone so you can ask the question to the guest directly. Or if you prefer, you'd rather we ask it, make sure you tell us in the question that you want us to ask, and I'll ask it for you because, of course, that's what I do. I'll be happy to do it for you. Please reserve the chat portion. Please tell us in the chat portion if you're having any technical questions or concerns. The co-chair of the international community, Dan Kubitsky, will be keeping an eye on that. I want to remind everyone on the call tonight that this talk is being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube channel for you to watch at a later date. We're really excited and honored to have two editors with us tonight who took brave and dramatic steps at their respective publication. Mike Fannin is the president and editor of the Kansas City Star and oversees 5 newsrooms in McClatchy's Central Region. In his 12 years, Fannin has edited stories that won the Robert F. Kennedy Award, the George Polk Award, and has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. His newsrooms have produced work that has earned many national and regional honors and have prompted changes in state laws, led to the resignation of political and business leaders, and have created a positive impact in local communities. Mark Stevens serves as editorial director for Stuff in Wellington, New Zealand. Since 2017, he's been responsible for the editorial vision, including the group's 60 national, regional, and community newspapers. He previously spent most of his 26-year career in Wellington on Stuff, on titles, as a crime reporter and an editor. He is chair of the New Zealand's Media Association and sits on the University of Canterbury's Bachelor of Communications Advisory Board. He is also an alumnus of the Edward R. Murrow Program for Journalists. I'd like to thank both of our guests for being with us, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So let's get into it. Last November, Stuff took a look at 160 years of covering New Zealand. Mark led a multi-month investigation into his own organization and asked an important question. Had we failed our own editorial checklist of fairness, accuracy, and balance with one important segment of our audience of New Zealand. Last December, the Kansas City Star ran an editorial that addressed issues raised in its 140 years of covering Kansas City. Mike wrote in the Star, the Kansas City Star prides itself on holding power to account. Today, we hold up the mirror to ourselves to see the historic role we played through both action and inaction in shaping and misshaping Kansas City landscape. Once again, we're absolutely honored to have both of these gentlemen here with us tonight to talk to us about the actions they and their organization took and what's happened since then. So Mark, Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jesse.
Okay, so let's start off, as always, with a little background. Let's start with you, Mike. Tell us what prompted that December editorial and what did you find out?
Well, it came from a reporter on our staff who brought the idea along with another editor to me in June in the wake of all the protests that were going on in America around the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, to just name a couple of people. And it occurred to me in the midst of that conversation that here we are, we're doing an investigation into the Kansas City Police Department. Here we are, we're doing an investigation into the Kansas City Fire Department. And then this idea comes along. And the reporter, Murray Williams, had done enough research into the topic that she was coming with some pretty specific examples from the Star's past. And I think for those of us who work in this generation of the Star's newsroom, we had a vague understanding of what that looked like. But when when she came to us with, some very specific storylines that we could pursue, it was clear to me that we needed to go into this head first, and that it needed to be as thorough and as complete, as ambitious, and as well researched as any investigation or accountability journalism that we're doing. And the result of that was a 7-part series. The column, the editorial you mentioned was the thing that got a lot of attention, but there were 6 other investigative stories behind it. And the reason we did that is because we felt like it was critical to go deep and as far as making an apology. The best way that we could make a sincere and authentic apology was to, again, take our sharpest instrument, which is our ability to do investigative journalism, and to turn that instrument on ourselves. And they were given the mandate that they could look at anything and dig and delve into anything. And the result was, a 7-part series that found that we robbed, Black Kansas Cityans of so much over particularly the first 80 years of our existence by failing to represent them to the larger community. And that template, once that template was established, it influenced coverage of African Americans for generations at the Star. And we had been writing for years about structural racism in Kansas City, but we had never addressed our own role in helping to create and support that structure. So the day she brought me the idea, within 5 minutes, it was a pretty immediate yes. And then the hard work began of figuring out how to do it.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. But first, I want to go to Mark, because you did something similar for Stuff. Now, Mark, tell us exactly what you found and how the investigation of how Stuff dealt with the indigenous population of New Zealand. How did that process start for Stuff?
Thanks, Jesse. And it's not a dissimilar story to Mike's, where it did involve an approach from a key staff member and a few others alongside them. But I think it's probably important just to dial it back for a moment, in that last year was a pretty big year for us as a business. Like the United States, we were dealing with the COVID pandemic, and we also had an election. But I think most importantly for us as a business, our unloving Australian owners decided that they wanted to part ways with us. There was a moment there where we thought we would be turning the lights off what's New Zealand's biggest media organisation. And at that time, we were saved, so to speak, by management buyout, by our chief executive and actually a former editor herself. And when she took ownership just after our lockdown, so sort of near the middle of last year, she decided that she wanted to put the Treaty of Waitangi at the centre of her company charter. And the Treaty of Waitangi is effectively New Zealand's founding document. It's an agreement between the government and the Indigenous people in New Zealand, the Māori community. And so editorially, we decided that we would kind of match that move within our own and quite renewed editorial code of practice and ethics. So that was sort of happening in the background. Another key factor was that we decided we would do away with sort of traditional measures of success in our newsroom, page impressions and the likes, and that we were going to put public trust as kind of the North Star for our newsrooms. And so there was quite a bit of work going on about what that meant and the difficulties in measuring that, really. But one thing was quite evident, and that was that a key proxy for trust was diversity. So those two sort of pieces of work were happening in the background. We got this approach from a key journalist and some others alongside her that challenged us and challenged me in a very respectful way about monocultural reporting. So that led to a very good conversation, I'm sure not dissimilar to Mike's, where we thought, okay, as a newsroom or a collection of newsrooms in New Zealand, we hold the powerful to account. We are also quite powerful, and therefore we should hold ourselves to account and to those same high standards that we expect of everybody else. And so that was really the trigger, I suppose, those three factors for us to launch, like the Kansas City Star, an investigation into our reporting of Māori people and Māori issues in New Zealand. There was 20-odd journalists involved over several months. We're lucky enough that we have national products and local products. So there was a mix of local reporting and national interrogation. And just the key questions were really, had we been, to your point, fair, accurate and balanced in our reporting of a big sector of New Zealand, or alternatively, whether we had stereotyped, marginalised part of our audience and community, or even helped shape some of the social stigmas that were evident in New Zealand at that time. So that's how things started here in Wellington.
Okay, so I have a three-part question for both of you, because I know, especially here in America and especially down south where I'm from, I'm originally from Mississippi, we've seen a lot of reckoning done in the media over the last decade or so about what the organizations did in the past during the civil rights movement and before. For example, we saw in 2018, National Geographic very publicly apologize for its coverage of not only the United States, but of the world in what some people call an exploitative way. But they also got pushback. So my question to both of you, and whoever, we can go to whoever wants to address this first. What was the reaction when the idea came up from your staff? Second part, what was the reaction from the community? And finally, and almost as importantly, what was the reaction from management? Because no executive wants to hear his or her employees criticizing the organization for which they work, even if the criticism comes from actions that were done decades ago. No publisher no CEO wants to see his or her employees criticizing the product. So what was the reaction from the executive suites? So first, the staff, second, the community, and third, the executive suite. And either one of you can take that. How about you go first there, Mike?
Well, I was going to say that, despite what people may think of Americans, we can still be polite. So I'll let Mark go first.
Okay. All right. Mark, it's on you, man.
We certainly don't think that, Mike, but thank you very much. Look, starting off with the staff, I think, one of the key factors in bringing the staff on board was the fact that this was driven by the staff. The reporter, Carmen Padahi, who's a Māori woman herself, it would be fair to say there was some worry or concern from some of the probably more senior and experienced staff, those who had been knocking around the newsrooms a bit longer, who may have felt that they were under the spotlight a little bit themselves. But by and large, the response from our staff was very supportive. I'm happy to be honest and say I found it challenging. I found that, there was some fear's probably too great a word, but certainly some nerves and worry when we went into this. We certainly didn't have a preconceived outcome in mind. The apology wasn't planned at the beginning of this investigation. It was a result of it. So overall, great staff support. From the community, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Mike, but Mike and I had a bit of a conversation last week, and I think we both lamented the fact that we had got great feedback and reaction from our peers in the industry, internationally and nationally. Locally, it probably wasn't as strong. We did see newspaper subscription cancellations. We did see some pretty hostile feedback of the view that the past is the past, that it was a different time, people were operating under a different set of protocols and rules, so to speak. Interestingly enough, we received 2 complaints to the New Zealand Media Council, which is our the regulatory body for journalism complaints in New Zealand, and both of those were from the children of former newspaper owners in our group. One from a former newspaper owner and one from a former newspaper editor within our group, who felt that I was apologising on their behalf. And in terms of management and the executive, very strong, overwhelming support. I mentioned at the beginning that there were some things going on at a corporate level around incorporating the Treaty of Waitangi, which is our founding document, into the company charter, at a similar time that we were incorporating it into our own, independent of that company charter, editorial code of practice. So strong support.
What about you, Mike?
I can say that there are many similarities to the work that we've done and the work that Stuff did, and I saw it in many different ways, from intention to results. So let me answer that by saying we understood from the beginning that the story we told, since we had historically speaking botched this coverage to the extent that we had to be as dead solid perfect as possible. And so just like any journalism that you're sort of anxious about, that pit in your stomach goes away with the more reporting and digging that you do. And so our team spent, hundreds of hours studying decades of microfilm pages, and they dug into state archives, private archives, congressional testimony, oral histories. We tried to find people still alive who were affected by our coverage. For weeks leading up to the series, we convened groups of scholars and community leaders for their views on the most important stories that went unreported. And like I said, to the extent possible, we reached out to surviving Kansas cities who were impacted by flawed journalism. Like Mark, there were nights, I can confess that I went to bed, just sad about, and sort of feeling some level of pain for what our coverage had wrought, because as the reporting was starting to tumble in, and you were piling, egregious example after egregious example, it really became personal, because, we're obviously the reporters, the editors who are working on this project, they're working for the institution that they're writing about here. And we all have a certain degree of respect and love for that institution. And yet we knew that there was a catharsis on the other side, hopefully. We didn't publish it expecting loud applause, but I'll say this, going down your list, Jesse, in terms of the staff, it's not something that we put out to the whole staff. The newsroom our newsroom was aware that that a team was working on this, but we generally don't preview investigative projects with the entire newsroom and get their opinion and hold a finger in the air. So I felt like it was important for us to follow the same protocol that we always have on these stories. And then as far as management, they couldn't have been more supportive. Fortunately, we were not quite in the same situation. Although it's interesting, both the Kansas City Star and Stuff changed ownership last year. Another similarity there. And when the Star and McClatchy emerged from bankruptcy as a new company, and we had new leadership, some old leadership, some new leadership, I can tell you that it was very heartening to get a very strong green light. None of this work was reviewed prior to us publishing it. We have a company that prizes local journalism and the ability to do local journalism, puts leadership that they think can do that in each of their markets. And so they trusted us to do the right thing here, and in fact encouraged us. I did give my boss a readout the weekend before we published on kind of where everything stood. And then we hit the publish button and we kind of held our breath.
Right.
And as Mark was suggesting, we did see really strong readership on this story. So if we were judging it based on the way that we would judge any investigative project, I would have to say it did very well. We got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of page views from these stories, and it went on for several days. And so the story got out there, and our peers in the industry were retweeting it. There were some high-level editors and reporters out there who have a lot of credibility on this topic, who were retweeting it and saying nice things. The local community was more of a mixed reaction, and really, that's the community that we're most trying to reach with this coverage. I think it helps that since then, and as part of the project, we announced that we had, aside from all those other advisors, and we had dozens of community leaders and activists who were advising us through this process. But at the end of that process, we also named a 10-person advisory board that will be working with us over the next year on coverage on issues of inclusivity in our coverage. So it wasn't a terrible reaction locally. It was just a bit of a mixed. Some people were very encouraged. I just got an email from someone else just as I was getting ready to start this meeting, thanking me for starting the conversation. And then there were other reactions that said, screw you, apology not accepted.
Right.
And, the first response I got was a vulgar one and a racist one. But we were prepared for that. And we had decided that wherever the criticism came from, whether it was more from the sort of white supremacist point of view, or just from the why is this in my paper point of view, or from people in the Black community had every right to be angry about this. We just decided early on that we're going to have to bruise on the inside, that we really couldn't show any of that we were just going to have to take our lumps. And that's part of an apology, is accepting the person that you're apologizing to, accepting, their reaction.
So let me remind everyone here on the webinar that you can ask questions as well. Please put your questions in the Q&A box that you see there, and we will be sure to ask the questions. And Mike just hit a little bit on what our first questioner wants to know about, but this question is for both of you. This question comes from Victoria Quaid, who wants to know, how are you holding yourself to account now that you've made these moves? How are you holding yourself to account? And who decides if you're living up to your new resolutions to be more accurate and fair? Who's grading you? And let's start with Mark with that question.
It's a really good question. And look, when I and we as a newsroom decided to apologise, I think I mentioned that wasn't necessarily a preconceived outcome when we went into this, but it was very clear once we went through the findings of that investigation, and as Mike said, the reporting started to roll in, that we needed to do it, that we needed to kind of reset and change the way we operate. But it was also important to me that we kind of acknowledged that wasn't the end of the investigation, sort of a set and forget, that it was the start of the journey for us, and that we needed to make some commitments alongside that. So as well as, how we kicked this off with a week of reporting and local and national coverage, we did a few things like we commissioned a local Māori artist to design our front page with pretty much, uninterrupted decision-making there on how he would handle that. Within our newsroom, we created something that is called a Potiaki editor, which is an editor who oversees our Māori affairs reporting going forward, but also who acts as an advisor to me and the wider editorial team. We've built a team around her, and it now has its own dedicated section in the newspapers and on the website as well. We committed to a national roadshow, so to speak, where I'm now travelling around the country. At the beginning of that, meeting with local iwi, which is, the various different communities within Māoridom, to consult, to talk to them, to hear what they thought of what we'd done, what they thought we could do better, and what we could do going forward. We were also very conscious that our own newsrooms weren't necessarily reflective of the New Zealand population. We calculated we had about 6 or 7% Māori, where it was about 16, 17% in the community. So we've undertaken to initiate a new intern scheme, which specifically targets young Māori journalists and bringing them into our organisation to make our own newsrooms more diverse. We've introduced introducing Te Reo lessons. Te Reo is the native Māori language, so that our reporters become more familiar with that language. For the week of it, we translated and changed our mastheads to the Te Reo name of all of those newspapers, and we've committed to doing that going forward just semi-regularly. This week, for example, for no reason other than it was time to do it again, we're translating our newspaper mastheads into Māori. We have formed a partnership with local ethnic media to try and increase the number of Māori voices in our newsrooms, or in our products really, before we shift the dial enough in staff. Another key partnership is with our government Māori Language Commission, and so we are translating some complete stories within our newspapers and websites into Te Reo Māori. We've developed a training and sort of workshop roadshow so that our staff feel more comfortable when they're dealing with the Māori world, which has got various cultural elements which are sometimes difficult or challenging for people that aren't familiar with that. And we have committed to an ongoing audit of our coverage to ensure that we are lifting our game and continuing to increase the number of Māori voices and Māori stories within our publications. So that are some of the key things that we've done.
Okay. So Mike, who's holding y'all's feet to the fire to make sure there's no backsliding?
Well, to some degree, it's this board that we created, and we burned our ships there. I would say that we intentionally painted ourselves into a corner. I mean, we didn't have to do that. That wasn't a necessary. We felt it was a necessary element, but it's not like here's a how to do this kind of template for those things. But a couple of pieces of context that I think are important, and then I'll go into all the ways that we're judging this. The last story that we published was around 1977, so let me just say there are a lot of good journalists and a lot of conscientious people who've come through the Star over the last 40 years. And because of them and other programs, we're not the paper that we were in 1960 or 1880. The coverage is significantly better, more inclusive over the last 40 years. However, I think a key acknowledgement for us, and it was, just doing the math and doing the right thing here. We had to acknowledge our role, our historic role, and the outcomes that we see today, because we're writing a lot about systemic racism in institutions around the city. We're trying to do the good journalism around that. And again, create change in places where change needs to happen, in the fire department, in the police department, two other major projects that we did last year related to structural racism. But what I think we realized in the process is we're doing this work, but it's not hitting that audience because that audience doesn't trust us. And that's why there was this sort of singular focus on speaking to those communities in particular. And it really wasn't intended to be a national project. While I'm thrilled that other papers may be considering doing something similar to what Stuff in the Star has done here, it was really a message, and an apology to that community. And so they're the ones those communities are the ones that are going to tell us whether we're doing better or not. But we're going to look at a number of things, both symbolic and tangible. On the symbolic side, we disassociated ourselves with our founder. We pulled his name and words off our masthead and our website, and that's because he was, as we wrote about in one of the stories in the series, he was supportive of who's considered to be the grandfather of redlining in America, who was a guy in Kansas City. So that was an important move for us, was just to walk away from the name William Rockhill Nelson. We've reached out to the surviving Black newspaper in Kansas City and offered to partner with them on fundraising efforts, because they're fighting to stay alive, as we all are, I suppose. And so, we've reached out to them to see if we can't partner on some coverage and on some fundraising opportunities that would help keep them stable, because we want to see the Kansas City Call survive as well as the Kansas City Star. We've increased coverage in a number of areas. We've just had our first board meeting last week, and I'm happy to say that we picked a tough board that's going to set the bar high for progress in the next year. So everything from and Mark mentioned it as well, diverse hiring. We want to improve the number of diverse journalists that we have in the room. Speaking from the standpoint of overall diversity, we're at about 31% of our room is diverse, 31% of our newsroom, but only about 17% of our reporting ranks, are African American. So, a couple of key areas. Also in the editing ranks. But last fall, we hired our first, Black assigning editor, and that's one of the things I've heard specifically from community members about: put people in positions of power and decision-making roles. And so we're working on that, and we've made progress, but more progress remains out there for us. And, but I think it started with the idea that we just had to acknowledge that what we did in the past has laid down the tracks for the road that we're traveling today. And if we don't address that, then we're going to end up with the same outcomes. Because I've seen over the decades, and I've been at the Star for almost 25 years, a lot of outreach. It hasn't worked. It hasn't been successful. And I think to some degree it's because we haven't had this conversation.
So it may surprise Mark that Americans are extremely cynical, and sometimes we don't trust very well. So I'll ask the question of both of you this way. How would you respond to a critic that said, well, you're only doing this because you're realizing you're not selling papers to your indigenous population, Mark, and to communities of color in Kansas City, Mike. So you're just trying to find some way to get those advertising dollars and get those eyeballs to your organization. And this is just the way you're doing it.
Jesse, here's what I would say. We're growing digital subscriptions every week. So, you know, we are growing. It's not like we're receding like many institutions. You know, our print subscriptions are declining, but print subscriptions have been declining in America since 1950. So that's a 7-decade trend that you're not going to change. But we are seeing growth in digital subscriptions. I would say to that cynic, I understand the skepticism, and in this case, it's well earned. But I would also say from the heart that this was not a subscription drive. You know, in fact, if we talked about subscriptions, it's like, how do we discount or give free subscription? You know, what are the programs that we can engage in that rebuild trust? You know, this isn't something that somebody's jotted down in the margins of their budget or their subscription goals for the year. You know, it really is an attempt to have a real conversation and to get past, you know, the past and move forward. You know, I understand the cynicism, but honestly, there was no one on the team who viewed it that way, at least on the little tight-knit group of folks that we had working on this project. There was nobody who was talking about that. We were talking about, and I'll point out that we took the paywall down for the entire series. So it's free for anyone to read. You know, we weren't trying to get people addicted to the content so they'll come back. On the other hand, we want them to know that we're honest brokers in the community, that even if we haven't been, and we have all these historical sins to you know, atone for, that's not where we are today. And we want to move forward. We want to have a conversation, and we want our coverage to be as credible as possible. And you can't have that kind of credibility unless you have a diverse room, unless you're representing a lot of different viewpoints. And then I think that credibility comes with it. But that's what we were trying to establish, is we're out here doing a lot of this work for you. I know you don't trust us, but that's what we're doing.
So Mark, how would you answer those cynics that say, hey, you're just looking for a new audience? You're not really interested in justice and fairness. You're interested in eyeballs.
Yeah, and look, Jesse, to be fair, there was certainly those critics with that type of criticism when we launched that. You know, you're doing this for subs, you're doing this for clicks. You know, some even accused me of doing it so that we could be woke. I was too old to really even understand what woke means, but it was ironic to me because, and I'm sure Mike would agree, there would be so many other easier ways if this was a PR gig to grow our audience. You know, if anything, there was concern it would shift the dial the other way. And I don't even think I could kind of articulate it any better than Mike in saying that for us, this was about our journalism and a decision that in an era of challenges for the media, you know, an era of misinformation, that the one thing that we needed was public trust. That really without public trust, we had nothing. And that this was a stake in the ground and a starting point really in trying to build public trust. So building subs and a digital audience, no. Building public trust, absolutely.
So let me ask this question that comes from Aspen Flughoft, which basically talks about what the next steps are. How, if at all, has this critical consideration of your public's handling of race influenced your handling of other similar marginalizing dynamics or marginalized communities? For example, gender, LGBTQ, ethnicity, religion. What lessons have you learned that you can apply to other marginalized communities? Since this conversation is about race, how can you apply it in the future? And are you applying it? And let's go with you first, Mike.
Yeah, well, Jesse, that is the mandate and the mission of the board that we just created. And, you know, we're not talking about more inclusive coverage of Black community. I mean, we are talking about that, but it goes well beyond that. And everybody is on board there. And our board, the selection of our board members represents all those concerns that you just ticked off there in terms of marginalized communities. So we're looking at this holistically as a bigger opportunity to be inclusive in every way we can and to be culturally competent. You know, I think cultural competency is required in newsrooms of the 21st century in a way that they weren't required of the 20th century. And so we're, you know, I think we're all ready to be more competent in that space. And like I said, a monthly meeting where we're going to go through a lot of specific examples. One of the things that we're doing specifically is a audit of our sourcing. It's not just an audit of the stories we're doing, but who are we talking to for those stories? Because not every story is race-based. Sometimes just representing all those people that you just talked about, all those groups, representing them in your stories about COVID and your stories about the business community and your stories about, you know, so they're not sort of seen as this one-off, oh, that's their racial coverage over here. You know, no, it's all intertwined in everything that you're doing. So we have to make all of our stories as inclusive as possible. And what I've noticed over time is, and I'm sure this is true in many places, sometimes when you get some good diverse sources, you overquote them, you go to them too often. We just need to develop new diverse sources. Those are great. Let's keep using those. Now let's go find other voices that we're not including all the time.
Okay.
And so that's part of the mission.
So Mark, how are you taking what you learned and applying it to other communities that you cover?
So I think one of the key things is where I mentioned that one of the triggers for this investigation was public trust and diversity as a whole, not just in terms of race, being a proxy for that. And that's what started this. And one of the things I found really heartening is, you know, just the other day, I heard a conversation with one of the senior staff here where it was around, you know, pronouns. They were looking at how they were going to handle the story around sexual and gender diversity. And hand on heart, I don't know whether that conversation either would have lasted as long or even occurred before this project. The other thing that has come out of it, certainly wasn't our intent again when we went into it, is that the project was called Our Truth. It translated to Ta Mātou Pongo, which is the Te Reo translation of that. And what we've decided to do with that as almost a brand is to evolve it now over the next year. And in fact, Ta Mātou Pongo's second phase rolls out next week in New Zealand. And if the first phase was looking at Our Truth as a company, the second one looks at Our Truth as a nation, so much broader. And then the expectation is that we will continue to use that approach, that investigative approach, and under that same umbrella brand to look at other minority groups in New Zealand as well, around religion, gender, as you mentioned. So that is very much our intent, and we do intend to roll this out further than what we have. Or, you know, not taking away from the fact that this first one was very much about and focused on our reporting, our racial reporting of Māori.
Okay. Mike, Kendall Shervin has a question for you, and I will address it to you, but I want Mark to answer it as well. For his organization, did the Kansas City Star go back and publish any stories you found through your investigation?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So did you, when you're looking through and finding these things that weren't reported, did you go back and re-report, or did you just say, hey, we didn't report on this time, and so maybe next time we know we have to?
Where we could, we did. Some of the examples that we used, Jesse, were so old and so dated, it was impossible to find even family members in some cases. In some cases, we relied on the Black newspapers of their time, and thank God for them, because they were there to chronicle, Black life in Kansas City in a really meaningful way. And we have to understand, even going back to the last question of, when you're talking about all those marginalized groups, Kansas City is famous some of the most famous Kansas Cityans, that the city still calls upon today were Black. And yet you wouldn't know that from reading the pages of the Star. So that's to some degree why we start there, and for many other good reasons. But, back to your question, we were able to find, for instance, and I thought this was very poignant, the son of, a person who was killed in the 1977 flooding. There was a big flood in 1977 here in Kansas City. And while the newspaper was focused on property damage in the most expensive, Tony retail shopping district in Kansas City, poor people were dying, and in poor neighborhoods all around Kansas City. And those stories really got second shrift, and in some cases weren't done at all. So that was an example where we were able to go back, find someone who was still living from that period, and re-report out that story.
What about you, Mark?
Yeah, I hope I'm not misquoting Mike here, but I think in some of his coverage, he referenced it was as much about omission as commission. And we certainly found that in many cases, our reporting of events was racist. In many cases, it was the omission. So we weren't covering or giving certain people a voice at all. We haven't gone back and re-reported those as part of the first series, but one thing we are trying as a kind of unique approach is the first young Māori man who was hanged in New Zealand many decades ago. The coverage of that, the event itself was pretty appalling, and the coverage of it was equally as appalling across the industry in New Zealand. So one thing we're doing is getting a young court reporter who works in the court system today to effectively cover that as if it happened today, and run those two alongside each other. So just as a bit of a contrast to how that should be covered or will be covered by us today versus what it was those many decades ago.
Right. So,
Mark, I think that's a great answer. And one thing we were talking about in the warm up for this is, and it's interesting to see it both here and 19 hours away across the world, right? It wasn't just racism. The coverage didn't just represent racism; it represented e-racism. And I think of Black Lives Matter today, and what that means, and then what our coverage of that day meant, and it was just, as Mark says, appalling. E-racism.
As we move into the final minutes of the program, I'll ask for a quick answer from both of you on this question. If your media colleagues come to you and say, hey, we loved what you did, what are some of the lessons we can take for our process from what you went through? Give us your top tip you would give to another media organization that wants to do what you did. Let's start with Mark on that one. What's your top tip you would tell your colleagues if they want to do what you did?
I think the top tip would be to make sure you cover it as openly as you do everything else. That's what this is about. It's about journalism at its core and following those same principles. And that will be challenging, but that's the only way you're going to get to an honest and truthful answer like we feel we did.
Mike, what would be the top tip you'd give to one of your colleagues that wants to do what you've already done?
I think the top tip would be, this is difficult work, but your community will appreciate it, and you will feel better after you've done it. Ignore that nervous feeling in the pit of your stomach and go ahead and follow the truth wherever it leads.
Well, as we are here getting toward the end of our program, there's a question that we want to ask both of you that we ask almost all of our invited guests here. So we'll start with you, Mark, but the question is for both of you. What does free press mean to you?
Free press to me means that all people have the right to a voice in publication without fear of interference or censorship. And I think in the theme of today's chat, I would just underscore the all at the start of that sentence. And that certainly means all people within your audience, community, country, the people that you're reporting for.
And what about you, Mike?
I don't want to steal too much from the last answer, but I'm going to give the 21st century, 2021, just coming off of January 6th and the elections in the United States and all of that. And I would say free press means to me that despite the, incredible discourse that happens on a daily, hourly, and minute-to-minute basis in a world where everyone is a publisher and everyone has a right to be a publisher, we have to be careful about the voices that we do choose to publish. And I would say what free press means to me in that environment is truth has a chance, and maybe has a fighting chance. Truth is, we're the truth tellers, and so we have to hold ourselves, to a higher standard, I think, than anyone, and not be afraid to follow that truth wherever it leads. So I think for me, it means tell the truth at all costs.
As I tell all of my journalism students at George Washington, you never end a conversation without asking the magic questions. So the magic question for both of you, is there anything you want to add on this topic that we didn't ask during this session? As we wrap up in a couple of minutes, is there anything you want to add that I didn't ask? Mike, go ahead.
I'll ask the same question that our reporter asked when she got her first question from the community, which is, I got a number, and this has been terrific. And thank you, Jesse and Dan and everyone. And thank you for the terrific questions. I would ask of the group that's watching, we have some ideas, we have some bullet points. We've got 8 to 10 to 12 things that we're pursuing, like Mark. And it's been great to be on the panel with you, Mark. I would turn that question to everybody in the room and ask them, what do you think should be next? What should be next for two very disparate and far-flung newsrooms like ours?
And Mark, what do you have to say that we didn't ask on this topic?
I'm happy with everything you asked, Jesse. I'd just, again, like to thank Mike and Jesse and everyone else that was involved, and all the people in the audience, and to wish you all the very best. New Zealand has watched what has been happening in the US across a number of facets over the last few months. And we've watched very closely, and we wish you all the best with some of the changes that you've got.
So
thanks, Mark. All the best to you as well. And I would ask Jesse, just, I guess the final thing is, let's visit again in a year and we'll see where we are.
Oh, definitely. This is a topic that I think we're going to be talking about in media probably permanently from now on, but not just coming up next year, but going toward the future in journalism from this point forward. Once again, we'd like to thank our fabulous guests for being here and coming on with us and talking about these difficult conversations we have to make journalism into what it should have always been. Just like America, we're always striving for a perfect union. Just in journalism, we're always striving to better ourselves and make our coverage into what it should be. So we'd like to thank both Mike Fannin and Mark Stevens for being here with us today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us, Jesse.
So for all of our guests who are listening, I want to remind you that the international community has some very exciting programs coming up. On Wednesday, February 10th, we're going to be hosting a discussion about the documentary 1,000 Cuts. Joining us will be the subject of the film, Philippine journalist and founder or rapper Maria Ressa, and the film's director Ramona Diaz. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you who've been here tonight for sticking with us through it. There were some great questions. We will be revisiting this topic both here and throughout the year, next year, and moving forward. Thank you so much for our panelists, for our guests, and thank you once again on behalf of the international community of the Society of Professional Journalists. For all of us, we'd like to thank you for being here tonight. Dan, do you have anything you want to add before we let everyone go?
No, just thank you very much, Jesse, Mark, Mike. Thank you very much for taking time to be with us and share your insights.
And remind us, Dan, where we can find the video if you want to watch it again later. Where can people find this video?
Okay, I posted it in the chat section. I'll do it one more time. We have a YouTube channel, and there's the link right there. It should be another day or two, and it will be up.
Once again, thank you for everyone for your attention. Thank you, Mark and Mike. And we really appreciate you being with us here tonight. Everyone have a great night.